Howdy YouTube, this is Dexter Nolan, here with a brand new video, which isn't a deck profile. It's actually a request video of two people. One guy asked me to go over why I played certain things in my BA and how I built my BA deck. Not really why I made my card choices, because I've explained that in my profile if you want to check that out, my deck profile, which was put up a couple of days ago. But more so why I decided to build it this way. Another person did ask me how I build my decks, so I figured, hey, why not hit them with two birds with one stone, my bad there. So yeah, you can extrapolate the information I give for this deck, BA, to most other decks. It's generally rules that apply to most decks, except for possibly OTK combo decks, which I think if you kind of play those decks, you know what you're getting into. You know you're going to have inconsistencies and awkward win conditions and going to be sacked by like random cards like Mind Crush or whatever that can just completely destroy your strategy. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first rule I have when it comes to deck building is recognizing and focusing on the win condition. How does my Burning Abyss deck win? Well, the simple answer is damage, of course, but if we want to look at it, the reason Burning Abyss usually wins is because they can simplify the game state and push for damage. They can quite literally, out of nowhere, float into big, badass 2500 Dante, who generates more advantage, floats, and adds back powerful trap cards like Firelake, which are win buttons. The other thing it does is Firelake, which I just mentioned, which is a win condition in itself against certain decks. Personally, my BA deck, how does it win? Generally by having the right balance of traps and monsters. I opted to play 2 spells. I think there's about 16 plus traps and about 22-ish monsters. I'm not quite sure on the ratios. I think it's 2 spells, 16 traps, and 22 monsters, but it could be 21 monsters. So what I done when building this deck was I opted to play Backjack. I figured Backjack has some good synergy, not great. It's not level 3. If it was, then it would be a god tier build. But what it does have, this deck, is an ability to choose your hand when you go first. Making Dante in this deck is easy. You can usually do it every first turn. No matter if your opponent has back row against you, even if you have to play through a couple of traps, you can usually still make a Dante. If you get one Rhino Warrior in the grave, that's when you get to choose everything. You get to send your choice of Scarm or Backjack. You don't send Graf or Sir. The reason for this is usually because you have limited quantities of those cards. And whilst you only have 3 of each of these cards, generally that's enough to get you through a game and enough to out-advantage your opponent in general. In fact, I'd argue that even with 2 Backjacks, you could do this. However, I like to play the 3rd for just how broken the card is. It's excellent. It's fantastic. If you resolve 3 in a game, that's 3 times that you should have pretty much taken away your opponent's chance to win. So if you do that 3 times, you probably won. This allows you to search monsters and get your monsters to your hand to then make plays. This allows you to get traps to stop your opponent from making plays. You open with Dante, a Graf, a Sir in hand, and 1 back row. You're going to want to search a trap, or a Backjack for a trap. By searching for a trap, I mean getting it to the top of the deck and banishing for your opponent's turn. However, if you have a Firelake, a Grand Horn, a Phoenix Ring Blast, and a defense position Graf on the field, then you're probably going to want to search a monster. Well, you're most certainly going to want to search a monster. So yeah, I hope that explains. Phoenix Rhino Warrior allows for this by allowing you to pretty much pick and choose the fiend you want to send, as well as Fiend Griefing, who also does that. There's various cards to allow and facilitate your decision making. Dante is a big one. He mills 3. If you don't hit any of these 9 cards, something is kind of wrong. But yeah, that's generally all I really wanted to say about focusing on your win condition. You need to know what your win condition is, out-advantaging your opponent, or dealing pure damage, or making combo plays, or destroying boards, whatever your deck is good at, and you need to build for that. You shouldn't do things like play Necros with 15 traps, and I'm talking about format Necros without all the gimped hits like Brio to 1 and all that stuff. I'm talking about Necros back when they were at the prime. You don't run traps and shit. You don't. Why? Because it doesn't help you advance your win condition. It's one less combo piece in a purely combo based deck. So yeah, that's the first rule. The second and third rules are kind of the same. One is what's your deck bad at and what's your deck good at. Those are the two rules. What this deck is bad at is, I kind of don't want to say there's anything this deck is bad at, but in honesty, it's dealing with Cosmos in this meta. But you can apply that to a lot of things. It's quite awkward against Klee as well, even though it really shouldn't, but it is kind of awkward against those decks. You can't Farfa their big things away, just because of problem, and you know you don't want to really go 1-for-1 with their scales and stuff. It's usually not very good. I'm talking about previous format Klee. If you want to apply it to the new format Cosmos, it's not good at dealing with big ships. And why? Pretty much the reason you should do this is so that you don't facilitate your deck to you don't tailor your deck to be good at things it's bad at, if you get what I'm saying. You don't gimp your own deck in order to for a single deck, and that's actually my fourth rule, which isn't. The second and third rule aren't necessarily things you should do with your deck, but things you should recognize, things you should look at your deck and you should name every deck your deck is good against and every deck your deck is bad against. Note these, then note how easy it is to circumvent these and how easy it is to lose these. We're good against pendulum decks, because Fire Lake is a card. You've those kind of Regeki breaks, all that kind of stuff. You've Twin Twisters in the side. You're pretty much an auto win versus pendulum matchups. However, if I decided to take out Fire Lake because it became average or not as good, or only run one of them and only run 1 or 0 Kagna, so I wouldn't have easy access to it, at that point I wouldn't be as good as against these pendulum decks. So at that point it would go on a deck. Pendulums will become a deck that I'm not very good against, or okay matchup against, or bad matchup against. And because of that, you really need to balance out what you change your deck to do. There's no point putting in cards that'll kill Cosmo, which is quite possible. You could run 3 times space and just kill Cosmo or whatever, especially with Backjack searching them every turn. But if you sacrifice your Fire Lakes for that, what really is the payoff? You're kind of gimping your own deck there for no real reason. You're making your deck worse against the best deck for making it better against the second best deck. You need to balance those decisions. I can't really tell you what you should and shouldn't do as far as card decisions or card choices, but I think you should recognize what your card choices are actually doing. I don't think you can go into building a deck and say, this card's good, this card's okay, I'll run this card as good, instead of this card is okay. When this card okay could be more meta relevant, help patch holes in your deck without sacrificing anything your deck is good at. In that case, okay card might actually be better, even if it's slightly more situational, or slightly less powerful but more consistent, whatever it is. In Monarchs, which are brick heaven, often the really less powerful cards, but that add that consistency, are far more important. It helps patch holes in the deck without necessarily sacrificing things that are overly important. So that's rules 2 and 3, and 4 was don't gimp your deck. And I kind of covered that with the last 2 rulings. As you can see, there's a trend here. There's only really one rule in Yu-Gi-Oh! For deck building, and it's focusing your deck. And these are all kind of sub-rules of that. So yeah, don't gimp your deck. Don't put shit in like Imperial Ironwall or whatever, Shadow Mirror or Light Mirror for this deck, unless it's a completely meta relevant. I remember there was an ARG 1 or 2 years ago. I'd probably venture towards the 2-year mark. Wow, I'm old. And I can't believe I remember this. Where there was a Girya player, Sean something. Oh jeez, whatever his name was. He played 3 Shadow Mirror, and he was my hero for like a week, because I was like, wow, he made Girya pretty awesome. And those are okay. Like, that's what I'm trying to get at. Putting weird side deck cards in your main deck isn't necessarily the worst thing ever, But remember what you're doing at 4. Balance that decision. Shadow Mirror would be, in Girgia, would be awful now. With Mermails and all these things, it would be very average against Monarchs, I want to say. It would be okay-ish, average against every other deck, you know, and then it's bad against a lot of decks. It's great against this deck, but you're gimping your deck. You really are gimping your deck, because that's a 0 card against a lot of decks, a lot more than it is against decks that will be great against. And there's a lot of decks it's just meh against, and you don't want meh cards when they're going to be shit against a lot of other decks as well. So yeah. I think that you should make your decisions based on what the meta is. If there's a card that completely savages the meta, if we were currently in a meta where the top 3 decks were Necros, I'm talking about full power Necros, but Necros, Cosmo, and Infernoids, those 3 decks, Iron Wall in the main deck would be perfectly reasonable, and I would say you should do it if you want to. It's a perfectly relevant decision. Right now, Iron Wall in the main deck, wow, I want to slap you, that's silly. And next rule is also a continuation of that, is side meh cards. Like, and by the way, when I say meh cards, I don't mean non-powerful cards, because a lot of meh cards are extremely powerful, and that's why they're meh, because they're just powerful and situational. Twin Twisters, perfect example, and Iron Wall, which I just spoke about. It's great against certain decks, fantastic, but it's just dead against so many others, so much more decks than that, and that's why it's a meh card, because in the main it's a meh card, because it's too situational. It's not great against too many decks. There's too many decks it's just not very good against. Twin Twisters, again, this is a perfect example of, and Regeki right here as well. Regeki's awful against floating decks. It's awful, it's not a combo piece. It's only good against a handful of decks that make big boards that can be broken by Regeki. I mean, so many decks just are immune to destruction or float through it anyways. So that's why it should be in the side. If you want an out to Dark Claw, have it in the side. Twin Twister is similar. There's so many decks that just don't really care, or personally, my deck doesn't even really care. And I'm playing Burning Abyss, a 20 trap build that doesn't care about Twister. I can chain so many of my traps. And even more so, like, I can draw, I don't really set 2 all the time. I usually set 1 or 2. And if you hit them, I'm like, okay, you simplified the game state. Wow. Big deal. If you had a good and evil, I'm laughing at you. It's just, and that's in a deck that runs this many traps. Against decks like Monarchs, I'm not sure how good it is. I'm actually haven't read much of the Monarchs. I don't see them as too much of a relevant problem with how often they break, but that's a discussion for another time. Twin Twister just generally kind of It's great against certain decks. It can really blow up Pendulum decks, but it's just that meh kind of factor, and it's the perfect word to describe it. It's that key feeling that comes over you when you see something that's good but also inconsistent or bad or awkward. Very awkward cards. Meh. Don't put these in the main unless you're certain it's good against enough decks to warrant it, or in your deck it's good enough. Grand Horn is another example. It's not very. You can't use it. I main 1. I do main the 1, and I have to admit it's because I'm too poor for a strike, and if that devalues the opinion a little, so be it. But I wouldn't main it 2 or 3 in the main deck. Why? Because it's meh. It's great against a lot of decks. It kills some Pendulum decks. It kills Exceed decks sometimes. Sometimes I'm being vague here. It's awful against Burning Abyss, kind of. It's great against Infernoids. It's awful against. It's dead against Cosmo, for God's sakes. You get where I'm going, and I think that's it. So side meh cards. Don't gimp your deck with. Don't gimp your deck with cards that are for specifically 1 or 2 decks. Recognize what your deck's good and bad at, and focus your win condition to beat the decks you can beat, and just admit that you can't beat certain decks without gimping your deck. And last rule, and I kind of want to wrap this video up in the next few minutes, is recognize your goals. Recognize what you're trying to do with your deck. You know, I think the first thing is, I see a lot of people doing, a lot of my friends, and I kind of don't want to say what they're doing is wrong, as in case I come off as a dick, but they put good cards in a deck and expect it to be a good deck. A deck doesn't become good simply because it has 40 good cards in it. No, it has to have 40 good cards that work in tandem with each other to reach a win condition and stop your opponent from reaching theirs. right? You can't just throw Valor in because it's a good card in BA and expect it to work. No, it's really not. It doesn't work like that. Same with the Shadow Engine. It's excellent, right? But it's it's crazily not amazing. It doesn't help you reach any win condition outside of game 2 and 3 even, but game 2 mainly. So yeah, I personally think you should really recognize your goal with the deck and focus towards that. And I know I'm preaching or repeating myself a lot here. You might notice I'm pretty much with all 6 of these rules saying the same thing, and that's because they're all kind of different ways of saying you should focus on your win condition. You should recognize your goals. You should know what your deck's good at, not gimp yourself, not side your main cards, and all of these things help you have a focused, strong, powerful, consistent, and good in general deck of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So yeah, I feel like that's all that can be said about this. If you want to ask any questions, I'm happy to answer in the comments below. If you want to make a video about something else, that's fine too. I just felt that this is an important thing for a lot of players that they don't realize. They play Yu-Gi-Oh and they can be good. They can be good players too. Don't get me wrong, but they don't really recognize what their deck's trying to do. So yeah, that's how I build decks. If anyone wants to know, I've got like about 13 or so regional tops since about 2009. I've been playing for a long time. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, comment below, tell me what you think. Subscribe if you want to see more. Decks are null now. Thank you.